I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. The idea was simple: drive up into the mountains, hike in a few miles, and camp by a secluded alpine lake. I wanted solitude, fresh air, and the satisfaction of surviving on my own for a few days. I had done solo trips before, but this time I planned to go further than I ever had. No marked trails, no established campsites. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I parked my truck at a dirt pull-off along a winding mountain road. The elevation was already high, and from here I would ascend even further. My pack was heavy, loaded with everything I'd need for the next 3 days. I locked the truck, double-checked that I had my map, and started walking. The hike in was harder than I expected. The elevation gain was relentless, and the air grew thinner with each step. I followed a faint game trail for the first mile, but beyond that, I had to rely on my map and compass. The terrain became rugged, loose rock, dense clusters of pines, and steep inclines that forced me to use my hands to steady myself. But I was making progress. By mid-afternoon, I reached the lake. It was everything I had hoped for: crystal clear water, untouched wilderness, and not a soul in sight. A few downed logs near the shoreline provided a natural sitting area, and a flat patch of ground nearby would make for a perfect campsite. I set down my pack and stretched my aching shoulders, taking in the quiet. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. I got to work setting up camp. First, I pitched my tent, staking it down securely in case the wind picked up. Then, I collected firewood, dry, fallen branches that I broke into manageable pieces. I kept my food in a bear canister and stored it a good distance from my tent. Everything was going smoothly. As the sun dipped below the peaks, the temperature dropped fast. I started a small fire, boiled water for dinner, and ate while watching the last light fade. The stars came out in full force, reflecting off the lake's surface like a mirror. It was perfect. I was exhausted from the hike, so I turned in early. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listened to the wind outside, and drifted off into a deep sleep. I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. My body was stiff, and my breath formed small clouds in the cold night air. I listened. Nothing, just the wind. Then I heard it, something moving outside my tent. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on dry pine needles. At first, I thought it might be a deer or an elk. But then the footsteps stopped, just outside my tent. I held my breath. My heart pounded in my chest. The fabric of the tent was thin. I could hear everything clearly. The footsteps shifted slightly, and then something brushed against the side of my tent. I stayed completely still, gripping the knife I kept in my sleeping bag. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? Unlikely. It would have gone straight for my food. A mountain lion? Maybe, but they were stealthy hunters, not the type to poke around a tent. Then a thought hit me: another person. That was worse than any animal. I forced myself to move slowly, reaching for my flashlight. I clicked it on and shined it toward the tent wall. The sound stopped immediately. I held my breath, listening for any movement. Nothing. After a few minutes of silence, I slowly unzipped the tent and peered outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow. The forest was empty. My pack was where I left it. The bear canister was untouched. No signs of anything unusual. Maybe I imagined it. The wind through the trees, my own breathing. It was easy to mistake sounds in the dark. I sat there for a while, knife still in hand, before finally convincing myself to lie back down. Sleep didn't come easy. Every rustling leaf made me flinch. Every distant snap of a twig sent my heart racing. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off again. The next morning, I woke up groggy but relieved to see the sun rising. I stepped out of the tent, stretching my sore muscles. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They circled my tent, stopping at the entrance, then veering off toward the tree line. My stomach clenched. Someone had been here last night, watching me. I scanned the area, looking for more tracks. The prints were fresh, clear impressions in the soft dirt. They led into the trees, but I couldn't see where they ended. I wasn't alone out here. I considered packing up right then and there, but I had spent months planning this trip. I had come all this way. Maybe it had been a hunter passing through. Maybe it was nothing. I decided to stay. The second night was worse. I made sure to keep my fire going, adding wood throughout the evening. I positioned my knife within easy reach. As night fell, the fear settled deep in my chest. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself that I was overreacting. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then, something pressed against my tent, pushing inward, just for a second. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, yanking the zipper open in one swift motion. The light cut through the darkness, landing on nothing but trees. But I could hear them, footsteps retreating, fast. I didn't hesitate. I threw everything into my pack, barely bothering to organize it. I doused the fire, strapped on my gear, and started hiking back. Right then, in the dark, I had no plan except to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. Every step felt like something was behind me, just out of sight. My headlamp beam bobbed with my movement, illuminating only a few feet ahead. The hike back was brutal. I tripped multiple times, my heart hammering, but I didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the reflection of my truck's taillights in the darkness. I ran the last stretch, fumbling with my keys, throwing my pack in the back, and locking the doors as soon as I was inside. I sat there, hands shaking, staring out into the trees. Nothing moved. The forest was silent. I drove down that dirt road faster than I should have, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I got a cheap motel room, locked the door, and finally let myself breathe. I still don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to. I had planned this trip for months. Just me, my kayak, and a stretch of isolated coastline in the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a test of endurance, solitude, and self-sufficiency. No cell service, no distractions, just the sound of the ocean and the whisper of the wind through the evergreens. I had charted my route carefully, planned my camping spots, and checked the tide charts religiously. I thought I had prepared for everything. I was wrong. The first 2 days were everything I had hoped for. The weather held steady, cool mornings, warm afternoons, and calm seas. I paddled along the rugged coastline, weaving between sea stacks and skimming past kelp forests. Seals watched me from the rocks, their dark eyes following my every move. Eagles soared overhead. At night, I set up camp on remote beaches, cooking my meals over a small camp stove and watching the stars until exhaustion pulled me into my tent. On the third day, I reached a narrow cove I had marked as my next campsite. It was beautiful. High cliffs on either side, a stretch of smooth sand, and a freshwater stream trickling down from the forest. I beached my kayak, unloaded my gear, and set up camp near the tree line where the sand met the thick underbrush. The cliffs provided some shelter from the wind, and the forest behind me was dense enough that I felt completely cut off from the world. I spent the afternoon exploring. The tide was low, revealing tide pools teeming with life, sea stars clinging to rocks, anemones swaying in the shallow water, tiny crabs skittering across the sand. I walked along the beach, scanning the horizon, enjoying the silence. The only sounds were the distant crash of waves and the occasional call of a gull. As evening approached, I started a small fire and cooked my dinner. The sky turned a deep orange, then faded into the soft blues and purples of twilight. I felt completely at peace, my mind empty except for the rhythmic sound of the waves. I didn't realize the tide was coming in faster than I had expected. By the time I noticed, the water had already crept farther up the beach than I had anticipated. I checked my tide chart again, frowning. I had calculated it correctly, or at least I thought I had. But the ocean didn't care about my charts. Something had shifted, perhaps a storm far out at sea, pushing the water higher than expected. I hurried to move my kayak farther up the beach, dragging it toward the trees. The sand made it difficult, the weight of my gear pressing it down, but I managed. I double-checked that everything was secured, then climbed into my tent, telling myself I would be fine. I had set up well above the high tide line. I would be fine, but I didn't sleep well. The sound of the waves seemed louder than before. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the water reaching my tent, pulling me out to sea. I checked my watch constantly, counting the hours until the tide would begin to recede. I told myself I was overreacting. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of rushing water. I scrambled out of my tent, my heart pounding. The tide had surged far beyond where it should have, swallowing the beach in a churning mass of foam and darkness. My kayak was still safe, but barely. Another few feet and it would be floating. I grabbed my gear and hauled it farther up, stumbling over the tangled roots and uneven ground. My breath came in short gasps, my muscles burning. The cliffs boxed me in. I had no way to climb higher. The only way out was back into the forest. I had scouted earlier. There was a narrow trail leading into the trees, barely more than a game path, but it was something. I shouldered my pack, grabbed my headlamp, and pushed into the undergrowth. The trees swallowed the last light of the evening, plunging me into near total darkness. I moved carefully, each step slow and deliberate. My boots crunched over fallen leaves, twigs snapping underfoot. Every few minutes, I turned to check behind me, half expecting to see the water creeping through the trees. The trail was rough, steep in some places, muddy in others. My pack felt heavier with each step, my muscles protesting. I had no idea how far I needed to go before I found higher ground. The map I had studied didn't show this terrain in enough detail. I had assumed I wouldn't need an escape route. Then I heard something else. Not the ocean, not the wind, something moving in the brush. At first, I thought it was my own footsteps echoing back at me. But then I stopped, holding my breath. The sound continued, a rustling, a heavy shifting of weight. It was close. I fumbled for my headlamp, my fingers clumsy. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees in a stark, white glow. I scanned the undergrowth, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. Then I heard the breathing. Slow, deep, not human. A bear. My mind raced. Running was out of the question. Climbing was impossible. I knew the rules. Make yourself big. Don't turn your back. Don't make sudden movements. I raised my arms slightly, my pack making me look larger. I held my ground, barely breathing. The bear huffed, a low, guttural sound that sent a jolt of fear through my body. I could see its eyes now, reflecting the light from my headlamp. It was maybe 20 feet away, partially hidden by the undergrowth. I forced myself to stay calm. It wasn't charging. It wasn't advancing. It was just watching. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The bear shifted, then, without warning, turned and melted back into the trees. I didn't move until I could no longer hear it. When I finally did, my legs felt weak. I forced myself forward, my body running on pure adrenaline. The trail leveled out eventually, leading me to a rocky outcrop overlooking the beach. The tide had reached the base of the cliffs now, waves crashing against the stone. My camp was gone, my tent swallowed by the sea. I spent the rest of the night on that outcrop, my back against the cold stone, watching the ocean claim the place where I had slept only hours before. By morning, the tide had receded, leaving only debris behind, driftwood, tangled seaweed, and the remains of my tent, half buried in wet sand. My kayak was still there, miraculously untouched. I didn't waste time. I packed up what little I had left, shoved my gear into the kayak, and pushed off into the water. My hands trembled as I paddled, but I didn't stop. I didn't let myself look back. The ocean had let me go, this time. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I had always liked being alone in the wilderness. No noise, no distractions, just me and the trees. I picked a remote spot deep in the national forest, well away from the usual camping areas. It was a place I had found while scouting with satellite maps, miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking in with all my gear. the kind of place where no one would stumble upon me by accident. The hike in was tough. I had loaded my pack with extra supplies since I planned to stay for several nights. The trail was barely a trail at all, just an old logging road that had been reclaimed by the forest. It was uneven, full of loose rocks and exposed roots. I had to watch every step to keep from twisting an ankle. After a long day of hiking, I reached my chosen campsite. It was a small clearing surrounded by dense trees, with a gentle slope leading down to a narrow creek. It looked untouched, like no one had been there in years. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine needles and damp earth. The sun was already dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the creek that I could get water easily but far enough away to avoid damp ground. I gathered wood and built a small fire, then sat down to eat my simple meal of dehydrated food. The first night in the woods is always the most unsettling. Every sound feels too loud. Every movement in the dark just beyond the firelight makes your skin crawl. But I had done this enough times to push those feelings aside. I reminded myself that I was alone, that the real danger was in getting careless, not in imaginary threats lurking in the dark. That first night passed uneventfully, except for a light rain that pattered against the tent for a few hours before dawn. I woke early, stretched my sore muscles, and started my day. I planned to explore the surrounding area, maybe do some fishing in the creek. I spent hours wandering the woods, following game trails, checking my GPS to make sure I could find my way back. The forest felt truly wild. No signs of human activity, just endless trees and the occasional rustling of unseen animals moving through the undergrowth. As the afternoon sun started sinking lower, I made my way back to camp. As soon as I stepped into the clearing, something felt wrong. It took me a moment to realize what it was. My gear had been moved. Not much, just little things. My sleeping bag was unzipped when I had left it zipped. My cooking pot was a few feet from where I had left it. My backpack was shifted slightly, as if someone had rummaged through it but then tried to put everything back the way it was. I stood still, listening. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the distant sound of the creek. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I wasn't alone. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sound. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I walked to my pack and checked it. Nothing was missing. My knife was still there, my food untouched. But someone had definitely been here. I thought about leaving, packing up and hiking out before nightfall. But I was miles from my car, and hiking through the dark would be dangerous. I told myself it could have been an animal. Curious raccoon, maybe. I forced myself to push down the unease and go about my routine. I built my fire larger that night, sitting with my back to my tent so I could watch the treeline. Every so often, I would hear a noise, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, but I never saw anything. Could have been the wind, could have been an animal. I stayed up late, my nerves on edge, but eventually exhaustion won. I climbed into my tent and zipped it up tight. I woke suddenly, heart pounding. Something had woken me, but I didn't know what. I listened, barely breathing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only faint orange light around the clearing. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just beyond the tent. My blood turned to ice. It was unmistakable. Not an animal, not the wind, person. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight, my mind racing. Who was out here? A lost hiker? A hunter? Someone who had seen my fire and come to investigate? But then why hadn't they called out? Why were they just standing there? The footsteps stopped. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I strained to hear, but the silence was absolute. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Then, finally, I heard retreating steps. Whoever it was walked away, disappearing into the forest. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up in my tent, gripping my knife until the sky began to lighten. As soon as there was enough daylight, I threw everything into my pack and broke camp. I didn't eat. I didn't even fully douse my fire. I just needed to get out. The hike back was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. I moved as fast as I could, my legs burning, my breath coming in short gasps. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors the moment I got inside. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. Eventually, I started the engine and drove away, not looking back. I still don't know who was out there that night. A camper? Poacher? Something worse? I tell myself it was just some harmless person who got curious, maybe a hunter passing through. But deep down, I don't believe that. I haven't been back to that forest since. I had planned the trip for weeks, meticulously checking maps and weather forecasts, making sure my gear was in order. It was supposed to be a straightforward solo camping trip. Nothing extreme, just a few days in the backcountry to clear my head and get away from everything. I chose a relatively remote area deep in the national forest, far from any established campgrounds. I wanted isolation, a place where I wouldn't hear the hum of distant traffic or the chatter of other hikers. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind moving through them. The trailhead was about 2 hours from my home, a winding drive through smaller and smaller roads until finally, the asphalt ended and I was on dirt. I parked at a small pull-off, shouldered my pack, and started walking. It was late morning, and the sun filtered through the trees in a warm golden light. Everything felt perfect. I hiked for several hours, moving deeper into the forest. The trail was narrow and faint, barely more than a worn path through the underbrush, but I had a good map and a reliable GPS. I wasn't worried about getting lost. The terrain was a mix of rolling hills and dense woods, occasionally opening up into small clearings filled with wildflowers. I made good time, and by late afternoon, I found a suitable spot to set up camp. It was a small, flat area near a creek. The water was clear and cold, running steadily over smooth stones. I pitched my tent a short distance from the water, gathered some firewood, and took a moment to enjoy the solitude. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush and the distant call of a bird. As the sun dipped lower, I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and ate while watching the flames dance. The quiet was absolute, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every little noise. That's when I first noticed it. Something felt off. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. The forest seemed the same as it had been all day, but the silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, like something was pressing down on the air. I scanned the tree line, my stomach tightening for no real reason. There was nothing there, just trees, shadows stretching long in the fading light. I shook it off, chalking it up to my imagination. It was easy to spook yourself when you were alone in the woods. I forced myself to relax, tossing another log onto the fire. I stayed up later than I intended, not eager to crawl into my tent just yet. When I finally did, I made sure my pack was zipped up tight and my knife was within easy reach, just in case. The night passed uneventfully, though I woke up a few times to the sound of something moving in the brush, probably just deer. Morning came, bright and crisp. I packed up my camp and continued deeper into the woods, following an old logging road that was barely recognizable beneath years of fallen leaves and overgrown branches. The plan was to make a loop, spending 2 more nights in different locations before circling back to my car. By mid-afternoon, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach twist. An old, abandoned campsite. The fire pit was still there, a ring of stones blackened by past fires, but everything else was in disarray. A tattered tent sagged on its poles, half collapsed. A sleeping bag lay crumpled nearby, stained with something dark. Bits of gear, boots, a rusted knife, an empty canteen, were scattered around as if someone had left in a hurry. Something about it was wrong. I moved closer, heart pounding. The tent fabric was shredded in places, though whether from age or something else, I couldn't tell. The sleeping bag was soaked through, likely from rain, but the stains on it looked too dark, too unnatural. I told myself it was probably just an old campsite left behind by a careless hunter or a backpacker who ran into trouble and had to abandon their gear. Still, I didn't linger. I moved on, picking up my pace. That night, I camped farther from the trail than usual, uneasy about what I had found. The feeling of being watched gnawed at me, but again, I saw nothing. I reminded myself that the mind plays tricks when you're alone in the woods. The second night was worse. Something woke me in the middle of the night. A sound. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something moving. Slowly. Deliberately. I held my breath, ears straining. A soft, shuffling sound. Close. Just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I reached for my knife, every nerve in my body on edge. The sound stopped. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I lay there, unmoving, barely breathing. Then, a footstep. Not an animal. Not a bear or a deer. A human footstep. I sat up, heart hammering. Silence again. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, listening. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light filtered through the trees, I emerged from my tent, scanning the area. Nothing was disturbed. No footprints. No broken branches. But I knew what I had heard. I didn't waste time breaking camp. I was done. I turned back toward the trailhead, moving quickly. I covered ground fast, my senses on high alert, every rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. By late afternoon, I made it back to my car. I tossed my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and pulled onto the road without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty forest. I told myself it was my imagination, that I had just let the isolation get to me. But I knew better. Something or someone had been out there with me, and whoever they were, they had been watching. I had camped alone plenty of times before. It was something I enjoyed, a break from the world, a way to breathe without all the noise of everyday life. I was careful, prepared, never reckless. But being careful doesn't mean things always go right. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, a place not heavily trafficked. I wasn't the type to go to campgrounds filled with RVs and families making s'mores. I like solitude. This place gave me that. It was about 5 miles from the nearest trailhead, down a barely there path that had likely been a game trail before hikers like me had started using it. It was late September, the days still warm but the nights dipping low. Perfect weather for hiking. I packed light but made sure I had everything: extra water, a good knife, my usual emergency kit. I had no cell service this far out, but I carried a GPS and a personal locator beacon just in case. I had done everything right. The hike in was uneventful, just how I liked it. No other hikers, no unexpected encounters with wildlife. The only signs of life were the usual: bird calls, rustling in the brush from squirrels or small critters. I found my spot near a small creek, not big enough to be marked on most maps, but steady enough to refill my water if needed. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got everything in order before the sun dipped too low. I ate a quick meal, sat by the fire, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The wind through the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the only person in the world. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know what had woken me at first. The fire had burned down to embers. The air inside my tent was cold. Then I heard it. A snap. Not a small twig, not the normal shifting of the woods. Something heavy. I stayed still, listening. Another step. Closer. My mind ran through possibilities: deer, maybe a bear. I had my food hung up in a tree, far from my tent. Whatever it was shouldn't have been interested in me, but it was coming closer. Then it stopped. Silence stretched out, long enough that I started to think maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had been nothing. Then my tent moved. A slow, deliberate pressure against the fabric from the outside. Not a swipe, not the bumbling of an animal sniffing around. A hand. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I reached slowly for the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever or whatever was out there would hear it. The pressure stayed for a long moment, then disappeared. I waited, listening. Nothing. Then footsteps, slow, measured, moving away. I didn't breathe until the sound faded entirely. I stayed awake, knife in hand, until the first light of morning bled through the trees. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, everything looked normal. My gear was untouched, my food still hanging where I had left it. No signs of anything, but as I circled my campsite, I saw them. Footprints. Human. They circled my tent, then led off into the trees. I followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into the undergrowth. I packed up immediately. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I wanted out of there before anything else happened. The hike back felt different. The same trees, the same path, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept my knife in my hand the whole way, checking over my shoulder more than I'd like to admit. When I reached my car, I locked the doors the second I got inside. As I drove away, I made a decision. I would never camp alone again. The story opens with the narrator, an experienced solo camper, setting out on a multi-day backpacking trip deep in a remote mountain range. They have prepared meticulously, checking weather conditions, packing necessary gear, and notifying a friend of their planned route. The location is rugged, known for its steep terrain, thick forests, and unpredictable weather. It had been a long time since I'd taken a real break. Work had been relentless, and I needed something to shake off the weight of constant deadlines and the buzz of city life. I chose a familiar stretch of backcountry in a national forest, one that I had hiked before but had never fully explored. The plan was to take a 3-day loop, covering about 20 miles, camping at 2 different sites along the way. I packed light but smart: tent, sleeping bag, a solid food supply, and my GPS, which I never relied on too much but kept for emergencies. The first day was uneventful. The weather was perfect, cool in the morning, warming as the day stretched on. I covered about 8 miles before settling at a small clearing near a creek. The water was clear, running fast over the rocks, cold enough to make my hands ache as I refilled my bottles. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and had a quick meal before stretching out to rest. It was around midnight when I first noticed something unusual. I woke to the sound of distant rustling, not the soft movement of wind through leaves, but something more deliberate. I listened, staring into the blackness outside my tent, but heard nothing more. Probably a raccoon or a deer passing through. I told myself not to overthink it and forced my eyes shut again. The next morning, I packed up and moved deeper into the forest. The trail was tougher than I expected, with steep inclines and uneven footing. Hours passed, and I barely saw any signs of other hikers. The isolation was what I had wanted, but something about the silence felt heavy. I kept moving, trying to shake the nagging unease that had started creeping in since the previous night. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something strange: a set of footprints on the trail. They were fresh, not more than a few hours old, but they weren't heading in one direction. They wandered, sometimes doubling back, sometimes veering off into the trees. The prints were deep. Whoever made them had been carrying a heavy load. I paused, scanning the forest around me, but saw nothing, just trees and undergrowth. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached my next campsite, a small flat area near the base of a ridge. It was more exposed than my previous spot, with fewer trees overhead, but the ground was dry, and there was a nearby stream for water. I set up my tent and gathered wood for a fire. As I moved through the underbrush, I found something that made my stomach turn: pile of bones. Small ones, likely from a rabbit or another small animal, stripped clean. They were stacked in a way that didn't seem natural, deliberate, almost arranged. I swallowed hard and told myself I was overreacting. Maybe a predator had left them. Maybe another camper had been here before me. I turned back to my tent, determined to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Night came quickly. The temperature dropped, and the wind picked up, whispering through the trees. I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to push away the tension that had been building all day. But then I heard it again, that rustling, closer this time, I turned, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Nothing moved. My breath felt too loud in my ears. Then, just beyond the edge of the light, I saw it. A figure barely visible standing between the trees. My heart slammed against my ribs. I didn't move. The figure didn't move. We stared at each other, motionless. Then, just as quickly as I had seen it, it was gone. No sound, no movement, just vanished into the trees. I barely slept that night. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was cutting my trip short. I packed quickly, my hands shaking as I shoved gear into my pack. I needed to get out of there. I moved fast, covering ground in half the time it had taken me to hike in. But as I neared the trailhead, my gut twisted. There, in the dirt, were more footprints. The same deep impressions I had seen the day before. They weren't heading in. They were following mine. I didn't stop. I walked faster, my legs burning with each step. When I finally saw my car, parked just where I had left it, relief flooded me. But as I approached, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single boot print in the mud near my driver's side door. Fresh. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty forest. I never went back to that trail. I had planned the trip for months, a solo camping trip deep in the wilderness, away from noise, away from people, just me and the quiet of the woods. I had done this kind of thing before. Set up camp, spend a few days hiking, fishing, and enjoying the isolation. It wasn't my first time being alone out there, but it would end up being the closest I had ever come to not making it back. The area I chose was remote, about 40 miles from the nearest town. A series of old logging roads led up into the forest, twisting through thick pines and past small, forgotten lakes. I drove until the road was barely more than a narrow trail and parked my truck at the end of it. From there, I packed up my gear and started hiking deeper into the woods. The plan was simple: hike about 8 miles in, find a good spot near a river, and set up camp for a few days. No cell service, no distractions, just me and the wild. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in the breeze. I followed an old game trail, cutting through the underbrush and making my way steadily uphill. After a few hours, I found a perfect spot. A small clearing near the river, flat enough for my tent and with plenty of dry wood for a fire. I dropped my pack, stretched my legs, and got to work setting up camp. By sundown, everything was in place. My tent was pitched, the fire was crackling, and my food was hanging from a sturdy tree branch to keep it away from any curious animals. I ate my dinner sitting on a fallen log, listening to the sounds of the forest. The river gurgled nearby, insects buzzed in the underbrush, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. It was perfect. The first night passed without incident. I woke early, made coffee over the fire, and set off on a long hike. The landscape was breathtaking. Steep ridges, thick forests, and the kind of untouched beauty you only find far away from civilization. I spent most of the day exploring, making my way up to a high ridge where I could see for miles. The river cut through the valley below, winding its way through the trees like a silver ribbon. It was on my way back to camp that I first noticed something was off. First, it was just a feeling, that strange, unshakable sensation that you're not alone. I paused on the trail, listening, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I brushed it off as my imagination and kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. When I reached my campsite, I knew for sure something wasn't right. My gear had been moved, not just disturbed, but deliberately moved. My sleeping bag was unrolled, my backpack was open, and some of my supplies were scattered around the clearing. At first, I thought maybe an animal had gotten into my things, but nothing was torn or chewed. It was as if someone had gone through my gear carefully and methodically. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. There was no one out here. I had seen no other vehicles, no signs of people, nothing. And yet, someone had been in my camp. I checked my surroundings, looking for footprints or any sign of who or what had been there. But the ground was dry, covered in pine needles, and I found nothing. My food was still hanging untouched in the tree. My knife was still strapped to my pack. Whoever it was, they hadn't stolen anything. They had just looked. I didn't like it, not one bit. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but it was late in the day, and I was exhausted. I decided to stay one more night, but I kept my hatchet close and built the fire up bigger than usual. As darkness fell, I sat by the flames, staring into the woods, listening for anything unusual. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a start to the sound of movement in the trees. Not an animal. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my hatchet and stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the campsite. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound. It was close, too close, then silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, gripping my hatchet, barely breathing. The forest had gone still. No insects, no wind, nothing. Just dead, suffocating silence. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed my gear in record time. I didn't bother making breakfast, didn't even put the fire out properly. Just kicked dirt over it and shouldered my pack. I wanted out of there, and fast. The hike back to my truck was the longest 8 miles of my life. I kept looking over my shoulder, every snapped twig making my skin crawl. The feeling of being watched never left me. I moved fast, nearly jogging at times, just wanting to get to my truck and get the hell out of there. When I finally reached the trailhead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the dirt beside my truck, were fresh footprints. Large, deep prints circling my vehicle. Someone had been here waiting, watching. I unlocked the door, threw my pack in the back, and got in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I hit the highway. I don't know who or what was out there with me. Maybe a hunter, maybe a local who didn't like outsiders, or maybe someone worse. All I know is that I'll never camp in that part of the woods again, and I'll never go out there alone. I had been planning the trip for months. A solo camping excursion deep in the forests of northern Montana, miles from the nearest town. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I had always preferred solitude on these trips. There was something about being alone in nature that made everything feel clearer, simpler. I had done plenty of solo backcountry camping before, and I considered myself experienced enough to handle whatever challenges the woods could throw at me. The drive to the trailhead took most of the day, winding through miles of gravel roads, deep into the dense forest. By the time I parked, there were no other vehicles in sight. I locked up my truck, shouldered my pack, and started the hike toward the secluded spot I had picked out on the map weeks prior. A small clearing near a slow-moving river, just beyond a ridge that would shield me from the wind. The hike in was uneventful. The only sounds coming from my boots crunching against dirt and the occasional rustling of leaves as small animals darted through the underbrush. By the time I reached the site, the sun had begun to dip below the treetops. I quickly set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and started gathering wood for a fire. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The river, only about 20 yards from my camp, was calm and steady, its surface catching the last glimmers of daylight. It was perfect. I ate a simple meal by the fire, enjoying the solitude. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional distant hoot of an owl or the rustling of wind through the branches. I stayed up for a while, staring into the flames, letting my mind wander, before eventually crawling into my tent and zipping myself into my sleeping bag. Sometime during the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow through the thin fabric of my tent. Everything seemed still. I listened for a long time, trying to pick up on any unusual sounds, but all I could hear was the faint trickle of the river. I chalked it up to my brain playing tricks on me and closed my eyes again. Then I heard it, a snapping twig, close, too close. My eyes shot open. My heart pounded in my chest. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, straining to hear past the rush of blood in my ears. The sound had come from just outside the tent. Another soft crunch followed, the unmistakable sound of a footstep pressing into the earth. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, a raccoon, but I knew better. Something about the weight of the steps, the way they moved, slow, deliberate, felt wrong. I reached for the knife I kept in my pack, fingers closing around the handle. I listened, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the sound. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Minutes passed, 10, maybe 20. I stayed frozen in place, gripping the knife, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was only silence. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I let my grip relax. Whatever it had been, it was gone now. Morning came, and everything seemed normal again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds chirped in the distance, and the river continued its steady murmur. Still, an unease lingered in my gut. I stepped outside and circled my tent, looking for any sign of disturbance. The ground was covered in a thick layer of pine needles, making it hard to tell, but near the edge of the clearing, about 20 feet away, I found something that made my stomach tighten. A single boot print, deep in the dirt. It wasn't mine. I knelt down, examining it closely. The tread was different from my own boots, and it was fresh. Someone had been out here, walking near my camp, in the middle of the night. The print was facing toward my tent, as if whoever made it had been standing there, watching. I scanned the woods, suddenly hyper-aware of every movement, every shadow. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but part of me hesitated. Maybe it was just a hunter passing through. Maybe it was just my nerves getting the better of me. I stayed another night. That evening, I built my fire bigger than before, letting the flames crackle high. I wanted light. I wanted to see everything around me. As darkness fell, I sat with my back to the fire, watching the tree line. The feeling of being watched never left. The woods felt different, heavier. I forced myself to eat, forced myself to act normal. If I let the fear take over, I knew I'd spiral. Still, every few minutes I found myself scanning the area, ears straining for any sound. The night dragged on, slow and suffocating. Sometime past midnight, the sound came again. Another crunch of footsteps, just beyond the reach of the firelight. My pulse slammed in my ears. The steps stopped, then started again, circling my campsite. Slow, purposeful. I tightened my grip on my knife. My fire cast long, flickering shadows, making it impossible to tell if someone was standing just beyond the glow. My breath felt too loud. I wanted to move, to do something, but I was frozen. Then silence. A long, unbearable silence. I didn't sleep. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I packed up my gear in record time. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to get out. I shouldered my pack, doused my fire, and started the hike back to my truck. My steps were quick, my ears tuned to every sound. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The hike back felt longer than it should have. The weight of my pack dug into my shoulders, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. It wasn't until I saw my truck through the trees that I finally let myself breathe. I stepped out of the woods and onto the gravel, my boots crunching against the stones. I was almost there. Relief flooded through me until I saw it. Another boot print, right next to my driver's side door. My stomach turned to ice. Someone had been here. While I was out there in the woods, someone had been here, standing right next to my truck. Watching. I didn't wait. I threw my gear into the back, locked the doors, and tore out of there, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the road. My hands shook the entire drive back to town. I never went back to that spot, never even came close. I still go camping, still seek out solitude in the wilderness, but I don't go alone anymore. because whoever was out there that night, they weren't just passing through. They were waiting. I planned the trip carefully. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but I respected the weight of it. Mistakes in the backcountry don't care if you're experienced. They don't care how prepared you think you are. They just happen. And if you're alone, you fix them yourself or you don't make it out. I drove out on a Friday morning, my car packed with a tent, food, water, a first aid kit, and all the essentials. The spot I picked was remote, deep in a national forest where I wouldn't see another soul. That was the appeal. The solitude, the quiet, the feeling of being disconnected from everything artificial. I had a GPS, but I didn't plan to use it much. I liked relying on maps and a compass. The hike to my campsite was about 6 miles in. I parked in a designated lot, locked up, and shouldered my pack. The first 3 miles were on a marked trail, an easy walk through towering pines and occasional clearings where sunlight hit the forest floor in warm patches. Then I veered off trail, following a dry creek bed that led to a small clearing near a ridge. This was my planned campsite. By early afternoon, I had my tent up, a small fire ring built, and my gear organized. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I sat on a flat rock, eating a sandwich, feeling that deep calm settle in, the kind that only comes when you're miles away from civilization. After lunch, I went to collect firewood. I wandered a bit, scanning the ground for dry branches, stepping carefully through the undergrowth. That's when I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. A boot print. It was fresh, slightly sunk into the damp soil near a fallen log. First, I thought maybe it was mine. I checked my own boots, compared the tread. It didn't match. Someone else had walked through here recently. It wasn't unheard of. Hunters, other campers, maybe even a ranger, but this far off trail. It felt odd. I kept collecting wood, trying to shake off the unease. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was sinking. I lit my fire, cooked a simple meal, and let the sound of the forest take over. Distant bird calls, the rustling of small animals in the brush, the occasional crack of a branch shifting in the wind. Then, another sound, a faint crunching, far off in the trees. It wasn't rhythmic, not an animal walking on 4 legs. It was slower, unsteady. 2 feet. I sat still, listening. Could be nothing. The forest plays tricks, branches fall, animals move. But something about it felt deliberate, like someone trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding. I turned off my headlamp and waited. Minutes passed. The sound stopped. I told myself it was paranoia, that the isolation was making me hyper-aware. I stoked the fire higher and forced myself to relax. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and lay in my sleeping bag. I slept lightly, waking up every so often at the tiniest sound. Around 2 a.m., I woke again. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The forest was still, too still. No wind, no animal sounds, just silence pressing in from all sides. Then I heard it, a deep, slow exhale. Not mine. It was close, right outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to stay absolutely still. My brain scrambled for rational explanations. An animal, maybe? A deer sniffing around camp? But deer don't breathe like that. This was human. I stayed motionless, listening. The breathing was steady, deliberate, as if someone was crouched just outside, waiting. Then, after what felt like an eternity, footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving away. I lay there for hours, heart pounding, gripping my knife in one hand. The steps didn't come back. Eventually, the exhaustion won, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning light filtered through the tent fabric. I unzipped the door cautiously and scanned the clearing. Nothing looked disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. But I knew what I'd heard. I packed up faster than I ever had. I was 5 miles from my car, and I wasn't wasting time. I kept my knife in my hand as I moved, glancing back every so often. Halfway back, I saw them, a set of boot prints in the dirt, following the exact same path I had taken in. Someone had been trailing me. The The prints led deeper into the woods, veering off the path, disappearing into the undergrowth. Whoever it was had stopped following at some point, or maybe they were still out there watching. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and sat there, catching my breath. Then, in my rearview mirror, I saw movement. A figure just barely visible through the trees, standing still, watching. I drove out of there and never went back. I still don't know who it was. A hunter? A local? Someone looking for an easy target? I don't have the answers, but I do know this. I was not alone out there, and I never will be again. That was the first thought that ran through my head as I sat in the dark, my back pressed against the rough bark of a tree, my fingers gripping the handle of my hunting knife so tight my knuckles ached. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the sounds of the forest. Rustling leaves, distant owl calls, the occasional snap of a twig. Normal sounds, but they felt different now. Every little noise sent my heart racing, because I wasn't alone. Started a day earlier, just before noon. I had driven up into the mountains alone, looking forward to a few nights of peace. I needed the quiet, needed to get away from the city and the constant noise of everyday life. I wasn't new to camping, had done solo trips before, and I had planned everything carefully. Brought enough food, plenty of water, a solid first aid kit, and even a satellite phone in case of emergencies. The campsite I picked was deep in the woods, far from any main trails, which was exactly what I wanted. It was quiet, untouched, and beautiful. The air smelled fresh, the scent of pine and damp earth filling my lungs as I set up camp. I pitched my tent near a small clearing, close enough to a creek that I could fetch water without much trouble, but far enough away that the rushing sound wouldn't keep me up at night. The first half of the day passed peacefully. I gathered firewood, cooked a simple meal over the flames, and sat back, enjoying the stillness. By nightfall, I felt good, calm. The forest around me buzzed with life, but in a way that was comforting. Crickets chirped, something small rustled in the underbrush, probably a rabbit or squirrel. Normal sounds. But then, deep in the night, something changed. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding, though I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint orange light inside the tent. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of the night had stopped. No crickets, no rustling, just silence. I listened, straining my ears. That was when I heard it. A slow, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of an animal, but something else. Something heavier. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. The steps came closer, crunching leaves underfoot. They stopped just outside my tent. I felt the pressure of something against the thin fabric. Not a paw, not a snout, a hand. The air inside the tent felt thick, heavy. My fingers curled around the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. And then nothing. No movement, no sound, just silence again. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and at some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the morning sun filtering through the trees. I sat up, my back stiff, my heart still hammering as the events of the night came rushing back. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, scanning the ground. There were footprints, not boot prints, not shoes, bare feet, and they were fresh. I told myself it was just some hiker messing around, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I spent the day on edge, constantly glancing over my shoulder, feeling watched. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I was probably overreacting. By the time night fell again, I had convinced myself it was nothing. That changed quickly. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard something. A whistle. Not a bird, not wind. A human whistle. Short, sharp, too close. I stood up, scanning the trees, my knife already in my hand. My fire cast long shadows, flickering against the trunks. Then I heard it again, from a different direction this time. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing, but I could feel them. Someone or something was out there, watching me, playing with me. I needed to leave. I didn't bother packing. I grabbed my bag, my phone, my knife, and started walking. I didn't care about the tent, the gear. I just wanted out. The problem was, I had to hike 2 miles back to my truck. 2 miles in the dark with someone or something following me. I kept my flashlight low, trying not to make myself a glowing target. My footsteps were quiet, careful, but I could hear them behind me. More than one set. They were close, but they never got too close. Like they wanted to keep me moving, hurting me. A branch snapped to my left. I spun, my flashlight catching the briefest glimpse of movement. A shape ducking behind a tree. Not an animal. Person. I moved faster. The closer I got to my truck, the more they closed in. Footsteps on both sides now, pacing me. And then, finally, I saw it, my truck, sitting where I left it at the edge of the trail. Relief flooded me as I broke into a sprint. The moment I reached the door, I yanked it open and threw myself inside, slamming the locks down. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, my headlights cutting through the darkness. And that's when I saw them. 3 figures standing at the tree line, just beyond the reach of the light. Not moving, just watching. I didn't stick around. I hit the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the road, not stopping, not looking back. I didn't sleep that night. I kept driving until I was miles away, only stopping once the sun was up. I checked my phone, no signal until I got back to town. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That some people whistled at me in the woods? That I saw footprints? That I got scared? I never went back to get my gear. Didn't care. Whatever was out there could have it. I don't go camping alone anymore, and I always trust my gut. I had been planning the solo camping trip for months. The idea was simple. 3 days alone in the backcountry, far away from people, noise, and distractions. I chose a remote section of a national forest, miles from the nearest road, reachable only by a rugged footpath that wound through thick woods, over ridges, and along a cold, narrow river. The location was perfect, isolated, quiet, and untouched. The first day was uneventful. I hiked in with my pack heavy on my shoulders, sweating under the weight of my gear. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the distant sound of birds and rustling leaves was the only thing breaking the silence. I made camp on a flat patch of ground near the river, setting up my tent, gathering firewood, and boiling water from the stream for my dehydrated meal. As the sun dipped below the treetops, I settled in, staring at the fire, feeling content with the solitude. That night, I slept well, only waking once when a raccoon rifled through my food bag, which I had foolishly left too low in a tree. I scared it off, adjusted the bag higher, and went back to sleep. It was the kind of disturbance I expected out here, annoying but harmless. The second day, I decided to hike further into the woods, leaving my camp set up as a base. I followed the river upstream, moving slowly, enjoying the raw beauty of the landscape. The trees grew denser the deeper I went, their trunks towering and thick with moss. I found animal tracks in the mud along the riverbank. Deer, raccoon, and something larger that I assumed was a bear. It wasn't fresh, but it was a reminder that I wasn't alone in these woods. Around midday, I stopped on a rocky outcrop to eat. The sun had burned off the morning chill, and the air was warm and still. I sat with my back against a tree, listening to the river, chewing slowly. That was when I noticed something odd. Across the water, maybe 30 yards away, there was a section of underbrush that looked disturbed. Broken branches, flattened grass, like something large had moved through recently. It wasn't there when I arrived. I watched for a few minutes, feeling my heartbeat pick up. It was probably an animal, a deer, a bear, something just passing through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That deep, primal instinct that tightens in your stomach when something isn't right. I forced myself to relax, finished eating, and started back toward camp, moving quicker than before. By late afternoon, I was back at my site. Everything was as I left it, but I still had that uneasy feeling. I checked my bear bag, my gear, and the perimeter of my campsite. Nothing was disturbed. Still, I decided to build my fire early, its warmth and light making me feel a little better. I ate, read a few pages of my book by the firelight, and crawled into my tent before it was completely dark. That night, I woke up to a sound outside my tent. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. It was a slow, deliberate movement, not the erratic rustling of a raccoon or the cautious steps of a deer. It was heavy, steady, just beyond the thin nylon walls of my tent. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight, my heart hammering. The sound moved to the opposite side of the tent, circling. My skin went cold. I tried to rationalize it, a bear, maybe a large buck. But no animal I knew of walked like that. No animal circled. Then it stopped. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed. Then, the sound of slow footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I stayed awake until dawn, knife still in my hand. As soon as the first light crept through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped out. The ground was damp with morning dew, my fire reduced to embers. And there, in the soft earth around my tent, were footprints. Human footprints. They were large, barefoot, and deep. They circled my tent, pausing at different points, then led off into the woods. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been watching me, walking around my camp in the middle of the night, barefoot, silent. I packed up in a hurry, shoving my gear into my bag without care for organization. I had planned to stay another night, but that was out of the question. I wasn't going to wait around to see who or what came back. The hike out was the longest I've ever done. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. But I never did. I reached my car, threw my pack in the back, and sped off without looking back. I never reported it. What would I even say? No crime was committed, no evidence of harm, just footprints in the dirt, a presence in the night. But I know what I felt. I know that deep, gnawing fear that settled in my bones. I still camp. I still love the wilderness. But now, when I go alone, I carry more than just a knife. And I never ignore that feeling when something doesn't feel right. I used to love it. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of being away from everything. That was the plan this time, too. I wanted a break from work, from people, from the constant noise of life. So, I picked a place deep in the woods, far from any main roads or crowded campgrounds. Just me, my tent, and a weekend of peace. I got there in the late afternoon. The sun was still high, but the light had that golden, warm glow that signaled the end of the day wasn't far off. The spot was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, a creek running nearby, the kind of place you imagine when you think of the great outdoors. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got everything ready before it got too dark. By the time I had a fire going, the sky had started turning deep blue, and the air was cooling fast. Felt perfect. First, it was peaceful. I cooked some food over the fire, listened to the wind rustling through the trees, and just enjoyed the stillness. It was the kind of quiet that felt good. The kind that makes you feel like you're really out in nature, away from everything. But as the night went on, that quiet started to feel different. I noticed it when I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. At first, it was just a feeling like something was just slightly off. The trees felt too still, the air too thick. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I noticed the sounds, or more accurately, the lack of them. The forest is never completely silent. There's always something. A distant owl, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets. But now, nothing. just the crackling of my fire and my own breathing. I told myself it was normal. Maybe the wind had shifted, or maybe the animals just weren't around this part of the woods. But I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the darkness between the trees. I stayed up longer than I planned, not really tired anymore. But eventually, I forced myself to crawl into my tent. I zipped it up, made sure my flashlight and knife were within reach, and tried to sleep. I don't know how long I was out before I woke up. It was pitch black inside the tent. My fire had burned down to embers, leaving only a faint orange glow. I didn't know what had woken me up at first. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, slow, just outside my tent. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear it. I strained my ears, trying to tell if it was an animal. A deer maybe, a raccoon. But the steps were too deliberate, too steady. Not the quick, light movements of an animal, but something heavier, something human. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear the faint crunch of dirt, the soft shuffle of movement. Then, nothing. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight in my shaking hand. I debated calling out, trying to scare off whoever was out there. But something in me told me not to. Told me to just wait. Listen. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. Felt like forever. And then, finally, the footsteps started again. But this time, they moved away. Slow, steady, back into the trees. I didn't move. I barely let myself breathe until I was sure, completely sure, that I was alone. Then, as quietly as I could, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Darkness, shadows, trees, but nothing else. I waited, my ears straining for any sign of movement, but it was quiet again. The forest had gone back to that unnatural silence. I wanted to believe it had just been an animal, that my mind had turned something small into something terrifying. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, watching. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every little sound made my heart jump. Every rustle of leaves sent a spike of adrenaline through me. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my things as fast as I could. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. I moved fast, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling that same crawling sensation on my skin like I was being watched. The hike back to my car felt longer than I remembered. Every snap of a twig made my breath catch. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I was being paranoid. But then, just as I was nearing the end of the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the ground, just off the path, was a footprint. Not mine. Not from a boot or a hiking shoe. Barefoot. And next to it, another. And another. Leading from the trees, stopping just at the edge of the trail, then disappearing back into the forest. I never ran so fast in my life. When I reached my car, I locked the doors the second I got inside. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know one thing for sure. I was not alone. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe just to get it out of my head. I haven't told anyone the full story, and I don't think I ever will. But if you're reading this, just know, this is real. Nothing supernatural, no ghosts or fairy tales. Just something that happened to me when I was camping alone. And something that could happen to you too. I've always loved camping. The quiet, the isolation, the way the world slows down when you're out there by yourself. I've done solo trips plenty of times before, and I've never had an issue. I knew how to handle myself in the woods. I wasn't reckless. I brought extra supplies, I carried a weapon, I let people know where I was going. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I picked a spot deep in the woods, about 10 miles from the nearest road, far enough that I wouldn't run into anyone. I liked it that way. It was late fall and the air was getting colder, but I didn't mind. I packed enough layers to keep warm and enough firewood to last the weekend. The first night was uneventful. I set up camp, made a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to enjoy the silence. The woods felt calm, and I felt at peace. The second night was when things started feeling off. It was small things at first. I'd set my flashlight down on a rock while gathering wood, but when I turned back, it wasn't there. I found it about 5 feet away, half buried under leaves. I figured I must have kicked it without noticing. Later, while I was eating, I thought I heard something moving in the trees. Not a deer, not something small, something bigger. I held my breath and listened, but it was gone as soon as it started. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. The woods play tricks on you when you're alone. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. It all sounds louder, closer, more threatening than it really is. I told myself that's all it was. But then came the footprints. I woke up just before dawn, the sky still dark. It was the cold that woke me up. My fire had gone out in the night. I sat up in my tent and rubbed my arms, shivering. That's when I saw them. Right outside my tent, in the dirt, were footprints, fresh ones, and they weren't mine. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. The prints were deep, clear, from boots bigger than mine. Someone had been standing right outside my tent while I was asleep. I unzipped the tent slowly and peered out. The woods were silent, empty. Whoever had been there was gone, but the footprints led away from my tent, disappearing into the trees. I told myself it had to be a hiker, maybe a hunter, someone passing through. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. There were no other campsites nearby. No trails close enough for someone to just wander in by accident. And even if they had, why would they come so close? Why would they stand right outside my tent in the middle of the night? I packed up and left that morning. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I hiked back to my car, looking over my shoulder the whole way. I thought that was the end of it, but it wasn't. A week later, I was home trying to put the whole thing behind me. I hadn't told anyone what happened. I figured I'd let it go, until I got a text. It was from an unknown number. No message, just a picture. Picture of my tent, taken from the woods, taken from the trees where the footprints had led. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't know why I agreed to go on this trip. Maybe I just wanted a break from my usual routine, or maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't as paranoid as I sometimes feel. I was never much of an outdoors person, but when my friend convinced me to join him for a weekend of camping in a remote forest, I figured it couldn't be that bad. Just a couple of nights, no big deal. We drove for hours to get there. The road stretched endlessly, narrowing the deeper we went into the woods. I watched as civilization slowly disappeared behind us, the occasional house or gas station becoming rarer until it was just trees and the sound of our tires crunching against gravel. I didn't say much. My friend was the one who planned everything. He picked the spot, packed most of the gear, and assured me it would be a good time. The sun was starting to dip by the time we reached the trailhead. The air smelled damp, earthy. We parked the car and unloaded our gear. I looked at the thick trees ahead, their twisted branches forming a tangled mess above us. I felt a strange unease but shook it off. I wasn't going to let my nerves ruin this trip before it even started. We hiked for about an hour before reaching a clearing. It was a decent spot, flat, surrounded by trees, and near a small stream. We set up the tent, built a fire, and cooked some food. By the time night fell, I was exhausted. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustling in the bushes. My friend laughed it off, saying it was just animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I kept my thoughts to myself. I barely slept that night. Every little sound made my skin crawl. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Each noise felt closer than the last. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps circling the tent, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, listening, but after a while, the noise stopped. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was overreacting. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and stretched. My friend was already up, making coffee. I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt around our campsite. Not boot prints, barefoot. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. "See those?" I asked, pointing. He glanced at them and shrugged. "Probably just a hiker passing through." I didn't buy that. We were miles from any other campsites. But I didn't argue. I told myself it was nothing. We spent the day exploring, fishing, and just trying to enjoy the outdoors. By the time night came, I felt a little more relaxed. We sat by the fire, talking about random things, the flames crackling in the dark. The uneasy feeling from the night before had almost faded. Almost. At some point, I had to go relieve myself. I grabbed a flashlight and wandered a bit away from the camp. The trees swallowed most of the light, their shadows stretching long and thin. I did my business quickly, not wanting to linger. Just as I was about to head back, I heard something. A whistle. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A slow, two-toned whistle. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned off my flashlight, suddenly feeling exposed. My ears strained in the silence. Nothing. The trees stood still. The air was thick, heavy. Then, just as I was about to move, the whistle came again. Closer this time. I bolted back to camp, heart pounding. My friend looked up as I stumbled into the clearing, out of breath. I didn't say anything. I just sat down by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was some kind of bird. Maybe. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound sent me into a state of alertness. And then, around 3 in the morning, I heard something new. Breathing, right outside the tent. It was slow, deep, deliberate. My stomach twisted into knots. I held perfectly still, my mind racing. I wanted to wake my friend, but I was too afraid to move. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I lay there, eyes wide, body tense. Eventually, exhaustion won out again, and I drifted off despite my fear. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately felt a chill. The fire was out, the ashes scattered. Our gear had been moved. My backpack, which I had left zipped up, was now wide open. My friend swore he didn't touch it. I looked around and noticed something even worse. The footprints were back. Only this time, they were inside our campsite. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to panic. But I knew, deep down, that we were not alone out here. I told my friend we should leave. He laughed it off, said I was being dramatic. But I wasn't joking. I started packing up my stuff, heart hammering. He rolled his eyes but finally agreed. As we hiked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched never left me. The whole way back, the forest felt different. The trees seemed darker, the air heavier. We finally reached the car, tossed our stuff in the trunk, and drove off. I didn't relax until we were miles away. When we finally hit the main road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We never talked about it again. We just went home and pretended like it never happened. But I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will. I don't know why I agreed to the trip. Maybe I felt guilty, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could still enjoy things the way I used to. Either way, when my brother called and said he had planned a weekend camping trip with a few of his friends and had an extra spot, I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. I used to love camping. Growing up, it was something we did every summer. Dad would load up the old truck with gear, and we'd drive deep into the woods where there was no cell service, no people, just us and nature. But that was before I started to feel that strange, gut-deep unease in places I used to love. Before I began noticing how the woods could turn on you when you weren't paying attention. We left on a Friday afternoon. The drive was long, almost 5 hours, with the last stretch of road being nothing but dirt and gravel. My brother, Jake, was driving. His 2 friends, Matt and Connor, were in the back, arguing about something stupid. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the endless trees. The sky had started to dim, the sun slipping behind the hills. The deeper we got, the more isolated it felt. No houses, no signs, nothing but trees pressing in on either side. We finally reached the spot just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a clearing near a small lake, completely off the main trails. Jake had found it on some online forum for hidden campsites. There was no one else around, just the four of us and the sounds of the forest. We set up camp quickly, pitching our tents and gathering wood for a fire. The air was cooling fast, and the distant hum of insects was replaced by the occasional rustling in the underbrush. We sat around the fire, eating, drinking, laughing. For a while, it felt normal. I almost forgot the way my stomach had been twisting since we first left the main road. It wasn't until later, when we were all settling into our tents, that I started to feel it again. That heavy, pressing sense of something being wrong. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the unfamiliar place, the dark, the way the fire's glow cast long, unnatural shadows against the trees. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something, not close but not far either. A steady, rhythmic sound, like footsteps crunching through leaves. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too even. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, only to be jolted awake by a sharp sound, like something snapping in half. My body went rigid, my ears straining. The fire had burned down to embers, casting everything in a dull, reddish glow. I listened, heart pounding, but heard nothing. Just silence. Too much silence. I grew up in the woods. I know what night sounds like. There's always something, a cricket, an owl, the rustling of small animals. But right then, it was dead silent. I sat up, trying to shake the feeling. I could hear Jake's soft snoring from his tent. Matt and Connor were quiet. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, just as I started to relax, I heard it again, closer this time. A snap, followed by a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. I stopped breathing. Someone was out there. I waited, barely daring to move, listening as the sound came closer. My fingers tightened around the knife I always kept in my pack. I didn't know what I was expecting. A bear? Some drunk hiker who wandered too far from his own campsite? But then the sound stopped, right outside my tent. I felt something brush against the thin fabric. I froze. My pulse was hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. The fire was nearly out now, barely enough light to see. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was gone. The sound moved away, the footsteps fading into the trees. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I must have drifted off, though it wasn't real sleep. More like a heavy, suffocating haze. When morning came, I stepped outside, half expecting to see something. Footprints, broken branches, anything to prove I hadn't imagined it. But there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed. Jake and the others woke up soon after, none of them mentioning anything strange. I didn't say anything. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just letting my nerves get the best of me. We spent the day hiking, fishing, trying to enjoy ourselves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The woods felt different, like they were watching us. That night, I barely slept. I kept my knife close, listening to every sound. But nothing happened, just the normal noises of the forest. I started to think I really had imagined it all. Then the last night came. I woke up to a sound I will never forget. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was breathing, low, slow, deliberate, right outside my tent. I didn't move, didn't even blink. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The breathing stayed there for what felt like forever. Then I heard something worse. The zipper of my tent. Just the slightest pull. Just enough to let me know someone was there. I lost it. I grabbed my knife and lunged forward, shoving my hand against the zipper, forcing it shut. I yelled loud, desperate, waking the others. I heard Jake scramble out of his tent, cursing. A flashlight flicked on, sweeping across the campsite. But there was no one there. Nothing. just the trees and the dying fire. We didn't stay to find out what it was. We packed up before the sun even rose, shoving everything into the truck and peeling out of there as fast as the dirt road would allow. No one spoke the entire drive back. We didn't stop, didn't look back. We never went camping again. I had never been afraid of the woods. I grew up camping with my dad, learning how to start a fire, set up a tent, and listen to the sounds of nature without fear. But that one trip, changed everything. I don't know how to explain it properly. Nothing supernatural happened, no ghosts, no cryptids. But I have never felt fear like I did that night. It was supposed to be a solo trip. I had been stressed out from work and figured a weekend away in the quiet of nature would help. I picked a spot deep in the Hoosier National Forest. It wasn't an official campsite, but I had found it on a hiking forum, a small clearing about 5 miles off the main trail. Supposedly, the spot had a great view of the stars at night, far from the city lights. I packed light, just the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, some food, a knife, and my camping stove. I didn't bring a gun, something I would regret later. The hike in was peaceful. The September air was crisp but not too cold, perfect for an overnight stay. The leaves were just starting to change, giving the forest a golden glow. I followed the GPS coordinates I had saved, winding through trees, crossing a small creek, and finally, there it was, the clearing. It was just as described, a small open space surrounded by dense trees. The ground was flat, perfect for setting up camp. I felt good about my choice. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and made myself dinner, just some canned chili heated over the stove. As the sun set, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, letting my mind clear. This was what I needed. No emails, no phone calls, just me and the wilderness. The first strange thing happened around 10 p.m. I was lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the distant hoots of an owl, when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but then I noticed a pattern. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my tent. I held my breath, listening. My first thought was an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon sniffing around for food. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Too heavy to be a raccoon, too slow to be a deer. It sounded like a person. I grabbed my knife and sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I told myself it was nothing. The mind plays tricks in the dark. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay back down but didn't sleep. I listened. Every small noise made me tense. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up to a snapping sound. It was loud, like a branch breaking under pressure. My eyes flew open. My fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. The moonlight was faint, barely illuminating the trees. Then I heard it again, crack, closer this time. I sat up, gripping my knife. My heart pounded. I debated calling out, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I waited, listening. The sound was moving, circling the clearing. I could hear breathing, not loud, but deep, steady. It wasn't an animal. It was human. I stayed silent, barely breathing myself. Then, the worst part, whoever it was, they sat down, just outside my tent. Not moving, not making a sound. Just sitting there. I have never felt that kind of fear. My mind raced. What were they waiting for? Were they alone? I had no way of knowing. My knife felt small in my hand, useless against an unknown threat. I thought about making a run for it, but where? I was miles from my car, deep in the woods with no clear path in the dark. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. My legs ached from staying still, but I didn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. No footsteps, no rustling, just gone. But I didn't trust it. I stayed in my tent until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. When I finally unzipped the tent, I stepped out cautiously. The clearing was empty, no signs of anyone. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, until I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my tent in a slow, deliberate pattern. They led to the spot just outside where I had heard the person sitting. Then they just ended. No return trail, no sign of where they had gone. I packed up in record time. I didn't eat, didn't even put out the embers properly. I just needed to leave. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made my skin crawl. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching me, but there was no one. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors the second I got inside. Only then did I let myself breathe. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had happened. There was no rational explanation. Someone had been there. Someone had watched me. But why? And where did they go? I haven't been camping alone since. I don't think I ever will again. The road to the campground was rougher than I expected. A mix of gravel and dirt that kicked up dust in thick clouds behind my truck. It had rained a few days earlier, so the ground was still damp in places, forming deep ruts that jerked the wheel in my hands. The forest on either side of the road was dense, the trees packed tightly together, their thick branches twisting toward the sky like skeletal fingers. It felt isolated. I had picked this spot for that reason. I had been craving some time away from everything: work, responsibilities, the never-ending noise of life. The idea of being completely alone in the woods for a weekend sounded perfect. No cell service, no distractions, just me, my tent, and the quiet hum of nature. When I finally reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I turned off the engine and climbed out, stretching my legs. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The only sound was the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. I walked around the site, getting a feel for the place. It was a good spot. Flat ground, plenty of firewood nearby, and a small creek just beyond the trees where I could fill my water bottle. The nearest trailhead was about half a mile away, but I wasn't planning on doing much hiking. Just a quiet weekend of reading, cooking over a fire, and sleeping under the stars. I set up my tent near the tree line, making sure it was on even ground. The fire pit was already there, surrounded by a ring of stones from previous campers. I gathered some dry branches and got a fire going, the orange flames flickering against the darkening sky. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and I pulled on my jacket, settling into my folding chair with a beer in hand. The silence was heavy, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't get in everyday life. I could hear the crackling of the fire, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the wind stirring the leaves. Every now and then, a branch would snap somewhere in the woods, but that was normal. Animals moved through the forest all the time. I cooked a simple dinner, just some beans and rice heated over the fire, then sat back and watched the flames dance. My mind wandered, drifting between thoughts of nothing in particular. I felt relaxed, content. At some point, I must have dozed off in my chair because the next thing I knew, the fire had died down to glowing embers, and the night felt darker than before. The air had turned frigid, and the forest seemed quieter than it had been earlier. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. I stood, rubbing my arms to warm up. The fire needed more wood. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the pile I had gathered earlier. That's when I noticed something off. The ground near my tent looked different. The dirt was disturbed, like something had been dragged through it. My stomach tightened. I hadn't walked over there since setting up camp, and I would have noticed if the ground had looked like that before. I slowly scanned the area with my flashlight, my breath coming out in short puffs in the cold air. Nothing, just my tent, the trees, and the darkness beyond. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon moving through the camp, searching for food. But something about the way the dirt was dragged didn't sit right with me. It was too wide, too deep. I added more wood to the fire, the flames growing again, casting a warm glow around the campsite. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. I laid there for a long time, listening. The forest was still eerily quiet, but exhaustion eventually won, and I drifted into sleep. A sound woke me in the middle of the night, a low, shuffling noise just outside the tent. I held my breath, my body stiff. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The sound moved slowly, circling the tent. Not heavy like a bear, not quick like a small animal. Just slow, deliberate steps. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers trembling as I clicked it on. The light cast a weak glow against the fabric of the tent, illuminating nothing but the nylon walls. The footsteps stopped. For what felt like forever, I lay there, barely breathing, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't. The night remained silent. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, every muscle in my body tense, until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. Only then did I unzip the tent and step outside. My breath caught in my throat. The ground around my tent was covered in footprints. Not boot prints, not paw prints, just long, deep drag marks, circling the tent multiple times. My mind raced. There was no logical explanation for this. If it were an animal, it wouldn't move in circles like that. If it were another person, why would they do this? Why not make their presence known? I needed to leave. Now, I packed up my gear in record time, stuffing everything into the truck without bothering to fold it properly. I didn't even bother with breakfast. My only thought was getting out of there as fast as possible. As I pulled onto the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The clearing was empty, my campsite already blending back into the forest. But that sense of being watched never left. Even now, back home, I can't shake the feeling. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I won't be camping alone again. I had been planning this camping trip for months. The idea was simple: a weekend alone in the woods to clear my mind. Life had been stressful lately, and I needed to disconnect from everything. No phone, no work emails, just me, nature, and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I chose a remote spot deep in the national forest, away from the usual campsites. I wanted true solitude. I packed light but made sure I had the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, plenty of water, a good knife, and my hunting rifle. I wasn't planning on hunting, but I always felt better having it when I was deep in the woods alone. The drive took almost 4 hours, and by the time I reached the dirt road leading to the trailhead, the sun was hanging low in the sky. The road was rough, barely wide enough for my truck, with deep ruts and overgrown branches scraping against the sides. When I finally reached my destination, there wasn't a single other car in sight. Perfect. I grabbed my pack and locked up the truck, double-checking everything before heading into the woods. The trail was barely a trail at all, more like a faint path made by deer and the occasional hiker. I followed it for a couple of miles, pushing deeper into the forest until I found a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. The ground was dry, the trees provided good coverage, and there was enough firewood scattered around to last me the night. This would do. I set up my tent quickly, making sure everything was secure. As the last of the daylight faded, I started a fire and cooked a simple meal. The night air was cool, and the sky was clear. I sat there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest: owls calling in the distance, the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional splash of something in the creek. It was peaceful, exactly what I had been hoping for. I should have felt more relaxed, but something was bothering me. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was that feeling you get when you walk into a room and forget why you're there. A vague sense of unease. I told myself it was just my mind adjusting to the silence after being so used to the constant noise of modern life. Still, I found myself checking my surroundings more often than I usually would. By the time I crawled into my tent and zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I was exhausted. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. I closed my eyes and let the forest take me into sleep. I woke up to a sound, a snapping twig. Close. My mind jolted awake, but I stayed still, listening. I knew the sounds of the forest well enough to tell the difference between a small animal moving through the brush and something heavier. This was heavy, slow, deliberate steps. Not a deer, not an animal at all. I held my breath and waited. My rifle was outside, leaning against the tree next to the fire pit. My knife was within arm's reach, tucked into my pack, but I didn't want to make a sound reaching for it. I strained my ears, trying to track the movement. Another step. Closer. I had to move. I reached for my knife as slowly as possible, gripping the handle tightly. Then silence. The sound stopped completely. Nothing. Just the endless, suffocating quiet of the woods at night. Minutes passed. I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it could be heard outside the tent. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the steps again. Moving away this time. Still slow, still deliberate. I waited until I was sure it was gone before I moved. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and grabbed my rifle. The fire had almost completely died out, casting just enough light for me to see the immediate area. I scanned the darkness, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. Nothing, but the feeling hadn't left. The feeling that I was not alone, that whoever or whatever had been out there wasn't gone. Just watching, waiting. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the dying fire, my rifle across my lap, staring into the darkness. Every sound made my skin crawl. Every shift of the wind sent my pulse racing. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I packed up my camp faster than I ever had before. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to leave. The hike back to my truck felt longer than it should have. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my senses on high alert. When I finally reached the vehicle, I threw my gear into the back and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced into my rearview mirror. For a split second, just before I rounded the bend, I saw movement among the trees. A shape, person, standing perfectly still, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I was back on the highway, surrounded by other cars, civilization, safety. I haven't been back to that forest since. I still love camping, still love the quiet of the woods, but I never go alone anymore, and I always keep my rifle within arm's reach. I went camping alone that weekend. I told people it was because I needed some quiet, needed to get away from the noise and stress of daily life. That was true, but only part of it. I had unfinished business with this place, and I thought if I came back, if I stayed there, I could make it nothing more than just another spot in the woods. The first time I camped there, it was with my brother. We had heard about this place from some guys at work. They talked about how it was quiet, isolated, good for hunting, and barely anyone ever went out that way. That was exactly what we wanted. No noisy families, no kids running around, no one ruining the stillness. Just the two of us, the fire, the trees, and the sky. It was supposed to be perfect, but something about it felt wrong even before we set up camp. We both felt it but didn't say anything at first. Just a weight in the air, like something waiting. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was too deep, like the woods were swallowing up sound. We made jokes, tried to brush it off. That night, neither of us slept well. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to a noise just outside the tent, something small moving around. Could have been an animal, but it felt too careful, too deliberate. Then there was the smell, like something had been left out to rot, but we never found anything. The second night was worse. We heard something circling the tent. I say something because I still don't know what it was. We never saw it, but we felt it. It was big, heavy, and it moved slow, like it wasn't in a hurry, like it knew we weren't going anywhere. We had rifles, but neither of us wanted to fire at something we couldn't see. That night, neither of us slept. By morning, we packed up and left without even talking about it. We didn't have to. Whatever was out there, it wasn't right. We told ourselves we'd been spooked by a bear or some other animal, but we never went back. Not until now. It had been years, and I convinced myself it was just paranoia, maybe our minds playing tricks on us. So I went alone, determined to prove to myself that there was nothing wrong with that place. The drive was long, the roads rough. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was already starting to dip below the trees. The air was still exactly as I remembered it. Too still. I shook it off and set up camp, forcing myself to move like I wasn't feeling that same pressure in the air, like something waiting. The first night, nothing happened. I sat by the fire, cooked my food, listened to the distant sounds of the forest. I started to feel stupid, like I had built this place up into something it wasn't. Then I woke up to footsteps. They weren't close, but they weren't far either. Slow, steady. They didn't belong to an animal. A deer moves in bursts. A bear is heavier. These were footsteps. Someone walking. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees. Nothing. The footsteps stopped the second I turned on the light. I waited, but they didn't start again. I told myself it had to be an animal and forced myself to go back to sleep. The second night, it got worse. I woke up to the sound of my gear shifting outside. Not rustling, not the wind. Something was moving my stuff. I stayed completely still, listening. Then, clear as anything, I heard breathing. Not an animal. Deep human breathing. I grabbed my knife and my flashlight and tore open the tent. The light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. My gear was scattered, my pack unzipped, but no one was there. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire, gripping my knife, listening. Then I saw them, eyes just beyond the light of the fire, low to the ground, reflecting back at me. They didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. I couldn't tell what they belonged to. Too high for an animal, too low for a person. I held my knife tighter. My rifle was in the tent, but I wasn't about to turn my back to get it. Then the eyes moved. Slowly, they rose higher and higher until they were level with mine. Person. I could just make out the outline of a figure standing in the dark, barely beyond the fire's glow. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just stared. And then, as slowly as they had appeared, they stepped back into the trees and were gone. I didn't pack up until first light. When I did, I found something that made my blood go cold. Footprints circling my campsite. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. I got in my truck and never looked back. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back again. I had always loved camping. Ever since I was a kid, there was something about being out in the middle of nowhere, away from the noise and distractions of daily life, that made me feel at peace. So when I got a few days off work, I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep in the woods, far from the usual campgrounds. I wanted complete isolation, just me and nature. I had been planning this trip for a while. I spent days mapping out my route, checking the weather, and making sure I had enough supplies. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, food, a knife, a small hatchet, and my .357 revolver just in case. I wasn't worried about people, but you never know what kind of animals might come sniffing around. The drive to the trailhead took nearly 4 hours. By the time I arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and the heat pressed down like a thick blanket. I parked my truck, double-checked my gear, and set out on foot. The trail was barely visible, more of a suggestion than an actual path, but that was what I wanted, real isolation. For the first few hours, everything went as planned. I hiked deeper and deeper into the forest, the sound of birds and rustling leaves filling the air. I stopped occasionally to sip water and check my map, making sure I was heading toward the spot I had marked. Eventually, I found a clearing by a small stream. It was perfect. I set up my tent and gathered some wood for a fire. As I worked, the feeling of excitement grew. This was exactly what I had wanted: silence, solitude, and the kind of peace that only comes from being surrounded by nature. As night fell, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal. The crackling flames sent flickering shadows dancing across the trees. I sat there for a while, just listening to the night. The usual sounds filled the air: crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional rustling of something in the underbrush. Nothing unusual. It wasn't until I got into my tent that I noticed something strange. The forest had gone quiet. Not completely silent, but quiet enough that it felt off. Normally, the night was alive with the sounds of insects and small animals, but now there was only an occasional rustling, like something moving in the distance. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer, maybe just the wind shifting through the trees. I forced myself to relax and eventually drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something had snapped me out of sleep, but I didn't know what. I lay there in the darkness, listening. The fire outside had died down to embers, casting a faint red glow through the tent fabric. Then I heard it, footsteps. Not an animal, not the random sounds of the forest. These were slow, deliberate steps. Something or someone was walking around my campsite. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my revolver, gripping it tight. The footsteps moved closer. My tent was zipped up, but I could hear them just outside, barely more than a few feet away. Then they stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I wanted to unzip the tent, to shine my flashlight outside, but something in my gut told me not to. I stayed still, listening, every muscle in my body tense. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I lay there for a long time, gun in hand, waiting to hear them again, but they didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise. The first thing I did was step outside, gun still in my grip, and look around. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. Had I imagined it? Maybe it was just an animal, something larger than I expected. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up my gear quickly, my eyes darting around the trees, half expecting to see something or someone watching me. The hike back to my truck felt longer than before. Every sound made my nerves twitch. When I finally reached my truck, I felt a wave of relief. I tossed my gear in the back and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back at the trailhead, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the kind of paranoia that comes with being alone in the woods. But even now, months later, I still think about those footsteps. I still wonder who or what was out there with me that night. And I still can't shake the feeling that I was being watched the entire time.